evening.
Hello, President. Mr. Vivek Charan, President, Our Businessmen Association. Mr. Rival Chatagun, the President of the Arima Businessmen Association. Mr. Rajiv Dipti, President, Supermarkets Association. Our presenters for tonight from Zatopek Solutions, Mr. Gerard Pinard and Ms. Jennifer Deonarine. Fellow board members and our audience tonight, my name is Surendra Maraj, and I will be your master of ceremonies this evening. I'd like to bring Mr. Vivek Charan, President of the Summer Businessmen Association, to bring welcoming remarks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Greater Tunapuna Chamber, the Arima Chamber, the Supermarket Association, and Samoa Business Chamber, I'm Vivek Charan, President of the Samoa Business Association. I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. I'd like to thank Suren and the people at the Greater Tunapuna Chamber for really pushing this event this evening. And I'd like to say welcome to the presenters and so on. These, ladies and gentlemen, are very much unprecedented and unpredictable times. Many of us are waiting with bated breath, those of us not on the essential list, to see when it is we will be able and when we will be ready to reopen to the public and when we will be able to enter the world of commerce once more. But it's not so simple. When we enter the world of commerce, we don't exactly know what we're going to face out there. It's a new landscape in addition to putting all those new measures that we need to do in order to make things safe in the workplace. We also have to protect our staff, we have to protect ourselves, and we have to protect our customers. However, the larger question is, how do we adjust ourselves to decisions that we have to make in the post-COVID landscape, or the post-lockdown landscape, I should say, particularly where businesses may have to make hard decisions for those of us that are in the driver's seat, that are piloting the craft, and we do not yet know what are we going to see before us. Generally, I think we all want to do well when it comes to employees, and indeed we should. However, there are times when we find ourselves on the difficult side of mediation. We find ourselves being lured into disputes with industrial court. And when our finance people tell us, and these are the words that we don't hope they tell us, it's time to get lean, it's time to trim the fat, it's time to make some serious financial decisions. How do we go about that? And how do we go about that in the right way so as not to promote conflict and not put ourselves and our businesses in jeopardy? So I think this is a very timely conference, particularly when it comes to industrial relations. Again, it's unpredictable times. We want to see everybody out there. We want to see the economy reopen. We want our workers to come back to us. But we also need to know how to handle these issues that are going to come up in the reopening of commerce after this lockdown period. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. I want to introduce Mr. Rajiv Dipti, President of the Supermarkets Association of Trinidad and Tobago, for brief remarks. Rajiv.
Good night, everyone. I would like to echo Vivek's sentiments. This is not the first time that chambers and the Supermarket Association have come together to do a forum such as this, and I think that I would like to thank our presenters tonight, Zatopek Solutions and Mr. Gerard Pinard, for taking the time to address some of these issues. We find them, as the supermarkets have been operating right now in the partial lockdown landscape. We've encountered some of them, and we expect to encounter more of them in the post-lockdown period. And I would ask you all to please ask all the questions right after the presenters have had their say. And thank you once again to Surin, Vivek, and Rival for organizing this forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv. And we have Mr. Rival Chatagun, President of the Arima Businessmen Association, to introduce our speakers tonight, our presenters tonight. Rival?
Hi, fellow presidents, our presenters, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Gerard Pinard and Ms. Jennifer Deonarine of Zatopek Solutions, Inc., specialize in industrial relations, human resource management, corporate communications, and coaching and mentoring. Their mission is to be a practical and forward-thinking organization that provides real-life solutions that are customized to satisfy the specific needs of each of their clients. They are committed to improving and healing relationships among their clients and their stakeholders by tackling fundamental issues to create healthy organization. Mr. Gerard Pinard holds a Bachelor's of Engineering degree in chemical engineering. However, in 1980, he made a career change to human resources. Subsequent to this, Mr. Pinard held several managerial positions in the human resources field. Additionally, he served as a member of the board of directors, the Employers Consultative Association, for 18 years, where he served as chairman for 4 years. Mr. Pinard also served as the first vice president of the Caribbean Employers Confederation for 3 years. He was appointed to several national committees, including committee to make recommendations for the improvement of the institutions responsible for the resolution of trade disputes, as well as the cabinet-appointed ILO 144 committee and the Standing Tripartite Committee on Labor. He currently serves as a director of the board of Trinidad and Tobago Credit Union Deposit Insurance Fund Cooperative Society Limited. Ms. Jennifer Deonarine holds a BTech Higher National Diploma in Human Resources Management and a BA Honors in Business. She is also a qualified mediator, having completed her training at the Dispute Resolution Center in 2013. In February of 2009, Ms. Deonarine co-founded with Mr. Pinard the management consultancy firm Zatopek Solutions, Inc., and currently serves as the firm's director and corporate secretary. She has had 11 years of hands-on management consulting experience in all aspects of human resource and industrial relations across a wide range of clients in all industries. On behalf of the Samoa Business Association, the Greater Tunapuna Chamber of Commerce, the Supermarket Association, and Arima Business Association, I now present to you Mr. Pinard and Ms. Deonarine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I wish you didn't read out all of that, because now everybody knows how old I am. But suffice it to say that our more capable presenter, which is Jennifer, will be doing the presentation tonight. I'll be popping in from now and then, mostly to answer questions at the end, to help her to answer some of the questions at the end. Not that she really needs any help from me. So without further ado, let me pass you over to Jen, in whose capable hands you will be tonight.
So good afternoon, good evening, everyone. All protocols observed. I will now be starting our presentation, where we are going to take the approach of addressing how businesses are going to reopen when we reopen. The reality is that we do not expect to continue under these stay-at-home and lockdown procedures as we currently are in, and we anticipate that employers are going to need a lot of assistance in how do we transition into this post-stay-at-home period. I have a presentation that I am going to do. We will send the presentation out to everyone at the end, but in the interim, I will just go through very generally some points, and then we could get into question and answer very quickly. So let's start off specifically, and we've used a lot of information here that we've collected over the last couple months, particularly in respect of Trinidad and Tobago. And the two items that we're going to refer to would be a market facts and opinions business outlook study that was done in April of 2015, as well as an HRC and Associates study that was done in respect of businesses and the response to COVID. So to start us off, what has been expressed as the top 3 challenges that businesses will face as a result of COVID? And those are financial sustainability, that is clear and direct, fear and concerns of stakeholders, particularly employees and the general public, and the changes in business operations, particularly with cessations to trade and industry, and how do we move forward with all of the international impacts that will affect all of our businesses. So again, we have here a presentation of some of the alternative work arrangements that a number of businesses have utilized
Jen,
as
if
a
I could
result.
interrupt for a second. I'm not seeing your thing on the full screen. Is everybody seeing it full screen? Hello?
No, we're not seeing it.
We're not seeing it.
No, I'm seeing
No.
your desktop, Jen, with your files on so, and I'm seeing it small, but the PowerPoint isn't open yet.
Is it open now?
No, still
No.
nothing.
Still CNV files.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me
Right.
stop
Well, I've
here.
seen you now, not the,
Right.
but not the presentation yet. Right.
Right, yeah.
Right. We're on page 3 there.
All right, great. So what is the impact on business? As I would have said earlier, some of the alternative work arrangement that we've seen organizations in Trinidad and Tobago utilize in response to COVID are flexible work sites, the use of flexi time in organizations that did not have that before, the use of staggered shift and reduction in work hours, compressed work weeks, and particularly we've seen job sharing. And job sharing is something that has existed for a long time in human resources, but we are seeing a reemergence of that with COVID coming into play. We wanna keep in mind that as businesses, as organizations, as employees, as entrepreneurs, we have to be very careful that we navigate this period of uncertainty to a time when things will get better. The cyclical nature of business, the cyclical nature of the international environment is such that things are going to get better. However, we have to carefully navigate this period to ensure that we do not create any potential disputes or issues or litigation matters that could affect us in the future. So in consideration of these different types of work arrangements, we have to be careful how we craft them, how we communicate them to our staff, and how we implement them. Additionally, we would have looked at business productivity ratings coming out of the advent of COVID in Trinidad. And what we would have seen that the results showed that actually 10% of businesses recorded an increase in productivity. These businesses were specifically manufacturers of cleaning supplies and consumer goods that served the COVID response. Interestingly enough as well, we saw 47% of respondents in this particular survey saying that there was no change in productivity. And to what may seem alarming to some people, are 43% showing that there was a decrease in productivity. However, that decrease in productivity was largely as a result of organizations not operating due to the health regulations that were put in place. And we need to form a context of this so that we understand in our own organizations, how do we transition into a phased reopening and eventually a full reopening of our businesses. We have to keep in mind that we need to keep employees motivated and engaged during this time because we are going to get back to normal operations. Additionally, there were some other impacts that were recorded: supply chain responsiveness and disturbances, as we're all aware, higher than normal levels of absenteeism. And later on in the presentation, we will address that particular issues and the way that we can curb the impact of absenteeism on the organization. Very clearly, we could see that there were cash flow challenges and there was an inability to meet customer and client demands. Organizations have had to change very, very quickly and to respond very quickly. And unfortunately, some of us did not keep up or plan for the future that became our reality as of now. So how do we move into the world of work? And we need to consider what are the things that are going to impact our organization post these stay-at-home regulations that are in place. Initially, we need to look at how many staff and which staff do we reintroduce into the workplace. And that reintroduction of staff has to be carefully considered in the context of the national regulations as well as health and safety protocols. We cannot risk lives for livelihood, but at the same time, it's a precarious balance between the two. And there needs to be a level of importance placed by employers on the health and safety of their employees, because there could be litigation matters, trade disputes through the industrial court that could be raised as a result of our short-term decisions that we hope would satisfy our long-term needs. In that regard, we also need to look at how we plan work arrangements and under what conditions. Do we do more telecommuting? Do we look at people working on a shift basis? Do we look at operating just a core staff? Do we look at our entire organizational structure and see whether or not it makes any sense at all for us to even reopen our business? And if we do, in what way? How do we serve our customers? And are our employees skilled enough to be able to serve those customers? And are we going to utilize our employees without having any infractions on their contracts of employment? We also need to do continuous health and safety risk assessments. We have health and safety regulations in Trinidad, a piece of law that guides the way that employers are to treat from a health and safety perspective with their employees, the environment within which they operate, and any potential risks and hazards that may come about during the period of employment. So we need to continuously do risk assessments to ensure that we are, as far as possible, ahead of COVID-19. It's a brand new disease. We are learning it day by day, and therefore we cannot anticipate or get ourselves or lull ourselves into a false sense of complacency where we think that we have the proper risk assessments already done and therefore measures are adequate. We also need to look at maintaining physical distancing through the layouts of our offices, the way that we coordinate our staff to attend work. Do we have the proper areas blocked off so that staff will not be allowed to congregate? How have we dealt with lunchrooms, canteens, bathrooms, public areas, smoking areas? How have we dealt with dealing with customers? Have we adjusted our policies and protocols to deal with meetings? With how do we address issues that employees may have in respect of their mental health? Those are things that we need to continue to address throughout this period. We also need to maintain open and consistent dialogue with workers. And that is beyond just informing and educating them on our return to work plans and policies, but we also need to consistently reiterate that. It is our responsibility to ensure the safety of our employees while at work. That is an underlying principle that we must ensure continues throughout this period. It's very critical as well to rely on expert advice in making decisions. Sometimes we may think that our use of innovation and new decisions that we may make are forced by the circumstances. The reality is, as the president of the industrial court stated a couple of weeks ago in an interview, we are still bound by good industrial relations principle and practice. And at some point, we may be called upon to justify the short-term actions that we would have taken. So it's very, very important that we use proper health and safety expert advice, proper industrial relations advice, and that we do the necessary to protect ourselves against any potential disputes and litigation. Moving forward, we need to determine before employees get back into the environment, what are the hygiene measures that we are going to apply to all our stakeholders. And those range from personal hygiene to mental hygiene and all the way in between. And these are adapted from an International Labour Organization document that was prepared on a safe to work procedure. And they've identified through consultation and agreement with the International Trade Union Confederation that we need to address matters of personal hygiene. That is as basic and simple as hand washing. We need to ensure we have proper protocols and do not take it for granted that our staff members, our stakeholders, our employees, our customers, our delivery drivers, our suppliers are aware of this. So we need to make it as obvious as possible. Respiratory hygiene is also a place that we need to create, if we don't already have them, strict policies and procedures for. And these refer to covering coughs and sneezes, using paper tissues when you cough and sneeze, and having specific designated bins that are secure for placement of those used paper towels, disposing of the contents of those bins in accordance with the strictest health and safety regulations. And of course, again, not only informing, but enforcing any policies and procedures that we may have in place strictly. The cleaning of workplaces, work equipment, and facilities. This means that we may now have to relook or recreate our daily cleaning protocols. We need to now create cleaning records for public spaces like bathrooms. We need to ensure that we abide by the physical distancing regulations and that we do not congregate in facilities that employers provide to their employees. In terms of ventilation, which is critical to dealing with COVID-19, we need to ensure that we use both mechanical and natural ventilation in the workplace, so that it is not just a matter of placing employees back into an air-conditioned environment and expect them to operate. Remember, we're taking a preventative and curative approach here. So we have to ensure that these protocols are determined and tested before we have employees return to the workplace. And understandably so, we have the appropriate PPE, and that persons are trained in utilizing the appropriate PPE. Masks are worn properly, hands are washed properly, gloves are worn when they are required, and that we have the proper safety personnel to ensure strict enforcement of these. This is our proactive approach to dealing with the spread of COVID in the new era that we're moving into. And very critical and the industrial court pays close attention to this, mental hygiene of all of our stakeholders. Are we providing a sense of a safe workplace, not just the image of a safe workplace, but also the sense of a safe workplace so that personnel feel safe enough to return to work and to be productive in what they do? The ILO went on to advise and to advocate against the development of safe return to work guidelines. And from a strictly IR perspective, this becomes very important for later on when we need to hold people accountable to any breaches that may take place. Not only are we required to establish policies, but we are also required from an IR perspective to make them known to all of our stakeholders and to strictly and equitably enforce them. The creation of these policies are going to determine our baseline for holding people accountable in the coming months. If it is that we may have a safety breach, if we may have an employee who is not prepared to comply, it would become very, very difficult for us to take any sort of action, inclusive of stopping the worker from working, if we do not have a justifiable reason to do so. Our rights as employers particularly are not unfettered. We do not operate in an environment, even in the COVID scenario, where we can do what we want when we want. We have to comply with good industrial relations principle and practice. And very simply, our work from home to workplace protocols ought to talk about having personal responsibility for ensuring that if you are not showing symptoms, that you are safe to return to work. When you do return to work and before you enter the workplace, there are transport things that you have to consider. Was I properly socially distanced? Did I make sure that I traveled in a vehicle? If it's my personal vehicle, I sanitized properly before entering and after leaving and before entering the workplace. When we get to the point of actually getting to our workplace, before entry is allowed, we need to look at things like symptom screening. That is temperature checking, ensuring that people who are actually coming into the workplace appear at least to be symptom-free. It's not going to be foolproof, but the reality is that we can at least put in place certain procedures that will reduce the risk of spread throughout the organization. We must also make sure that we do things like register entries and exits of persons into our compound. And that from a safety perspective is always critical, but particularly in the COVID environment, it will allow us to do things like contact tracing. It will allow us to ensure that we do not create congestion and congregation in areas because it's not acceptable based on the World Health Organization guidelines, which we need to also comply with. while not treading over employee rights as well, and making sure that we maintain that the workplace remains a safe place. Dealing with suppliers and clients, extremely important for us. Sorry, leaving the workplace. It's very, very, very important for us when we are in the workplace and leaving the workplace that we consider public areas. So we look at bathroom facilities, canteens and rest areas, changing rooms, the organization of workspaces, how we have employees sit and operate. Do we create an environment where people are congregating or overcrowding? Do we have restricted areas? Have we determined where we have a sick bay? These are things that as organizations we need to prepare for, at least from a procedural and protocol perspective, before getting into the organization. And we also need to do that with any visitors, suppliers, clients, visitors to the organization, anybody at all who may be present on our work site. We also need to be very, very careful when it comes to vulnerable workers. And as we've all been aware, these vulnerable workers would be those who we describe as having pre-existing conditions, or they are more susceptible to the disease. We do not want to put them individually at risk, nor do we want to expose them to other workers by continuing to have them in the workplace. Therefore, and only a doctor could prescribe when you have a vulnerable worker with a pre-existing condition, whether it's safe for that person to return to work. So we would advocate that employers look to that option before addressing a vulnerable worker or somebody who has exhibited any symptoms or who has stated that they are classified as vulnerable with a pre-existing condition before having them come to work. We also need to have mental health protection, and clearly, if that, we must all understand this, there must be a development of a protocol that addresses if an employee, a supplier, a visitor were to develop symptoms at the workplace. And this would include ensuring that we have isolation procedures, that we have contact information for health services, the appropriate health services, that we strictly restrict contact of anybody who may be showing symptoms of COVID, that we sanitize and clean areas adequately, and we have the right persons with the right PPE and the right sort of cleaning materials to sanitize the workplace. And based on keeping our proper records, we identify any contact that could have taken place with anybody within the organization. Going now into some very detailed positions on issues that we see coming up in the coming weeks and months, primarily would be in dealing with leave procedures. Organizations have already started to complain, largely because they are unprepared. And what we are saying is, therefore, become prepared, that we do not know how to deal with this unprecedented absenteeism. And what some employers have said is that they have looked at different options to consider for dealing with this absenteeism. Some employers have looked at additional paid leave. Of course, this is in the context of affordability. Not all companies can afford the same thing, but we have different levels of additional paid leave that we could consider, and we'll make some recommendations soon for you to consider. Lots of organizations, as we could see here, almost a quarter of them have not yet determined how they're going to deal with this. When the influx of high absenteeism comes in, do we apply our normal procedures, or are we going to deal with it on a case-by-case basis? And based on some more data that we've collected, we have seen that the majority of employers have in fact decided that they are going to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. From an industrial relations perspective, that could create potential disputes or gray areas, as we like to say. Because when we deal with things on a case-by-case basis, we sometimes create precedents for other employees, which we do not realize by our own action. Therefore, we would advocate for at least having a framework or a procedure or a policy that guides, with enough flexibility built into it, that guides how we deal with this level of unprecedented level of absenteeism. And I will close the presentation with some very brief recommendations for addressing the changing business needs going forward. One of the most important things we need to do is we need to look at the use of, for all our employees, of all outstanding leave entitlements to allow employees to receive pay for as long a period as possible. This storm, we are all weathering it together, and we have to ensure that when we get back to our normal operations, that we would have treated fairly with everyone. And we think that it's something that we do need to consider. How do we deal with not just outstanding leave balances that exist within the normal framework of our policies, but also any additional time away from work for reasons such as people don't have caretaking services for their children. There may also be people who, for reasons of having to be isolated because of contact with somebody with the disease, they are unable to attend work. Do we take the decision that we treat this as no pay? The reality is that we at least have to consider it. The decision to treat with time away from work as no pay is not necessarily a wrong one, once we can justify it within the larger context of our business. We also think that it's a good time to be innovative in the use of additional time away from work by possibly looking at the 13 or 14 public holidays that we have per year, and perhaps telling workers that we are going to use those 14 days against any additional time away from work, rather than just allowing a public holiday to continue as normal. Or we can look at offsetting future vacation leave. So we will say we will advance your vacation leave for the next year in order for you to continue to be paid for a particular period. There are lots of options in between there that we can come up with, but the important thing is that we start to discuss them and we reach at least a philosophical basis for that discussion. Another option, and of course it's based on the company's affordability, is to look at partial payments of salaries for periods away from work. It is not that employers are required to continue to pay their employees if they are not working, but it is best that we consider how do we manage the situation currently and going forward so that we do not necessarily create further disruption in the organization when persons do have to come back to work. And that disruption particularly would be in the case of litigation and trade disputes before the industrial court. We can also look at, and I know some people have asked us, some of our clients have asked us about this concept of furlough. And furlough in Trinidad is commonly referred to, our version of it is a temporary layoff, where we can suspend salary benefits, salary payments, for a predetermined period. But we do have to engage in some level of consultation and discussion with employees before imposing it. There is also an additional type of temporary layoff we can look at, which is the suspension of not only salary, but also benefits. So health benefits, pension benefits, basically we suspend your service for a period because there's a cost attached to continuing to keep those benefits in play. Again, there's a particular structure and strategy of consultation that has to be undertaken because we are not breaching good industrial relations principle and practice in doing any of these things. Organizations, we would implore that you make all attempts to assist your employees in applications for government grants to mitigate against any loss of salaries, any reductions. Because that could potentially become a dispute, because as the president of the industrial court said as well, we are likely to see a plethora of disputes coming to the court in the upcoming period because of the number of things that have been done, the number of changes that have impacted organizations, and the number of persons who are likely to challenge them. And as an absolute total last resort, and I know we'll get some questions on this, to look at the option of retrenchment on the grounds of affordability. And we do have legislation in Trinidad, the Retrenchment and Severance Benefits Act, that guides any option for us to do retrenchment. Some people believe that we do have legislation in respect of a temporary layoff, and the reality is that we don't. However, we do have court judgments from the industrial court where precedents has been set that tells us that a maximum reasonable period for a temporary layoff would be 3 months. So that we would suggest that it is very, very important that we consider the entirety of our business and how we expect to transition forward before we make any decisions in respect of the reopening. Thank you for listening to the presentation. The floor will now be open to any questions at all.
Before we do questions, everyone, I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Honorable Penelope Beckles, Trinidad and Tobago's representative to the United Nations.
Good evening, Ms. Eccles.
Welcome.
Also, we would have shown the protocols prior to the presentation itself. And I just want to remind persons to go to reactions and raise your hand, and we would unmute you so that you can go ahead and ask your questions. Okay, we can now go ahead.
All right, so I'm seeing a question. Well, I'm seeing a statement that somebody made in the chat, so maybe I could respond to that. Somebody has said we may have retrenchments based on change of work function or activities. And Avinash, to be honest, that statement could be true, but it's based on the circumstances. In order for us to have a retrenchment based on change of work functions or activities, we would have to prove that the job itself has changed so much so that the individual or the individuals that hold the position can no longer perform the job, or that the job has been enlarged or changed so much that we now require somebody with greater skills, abilities, qualifications, or experience to actually perform the job. A retrenchment is as a result of having surplus labor. The reasons for surplus labor could be varied, so that it is not simply that an employer does not have the option of changing the requirements of the job, that it will result in a retrenchment.
I'm seeing a question as well from Vishnu Barup, asking that if an industry is shut down for 12 months or more, what should I do with my staff? And as Jen said, the guidance that we've got from the industrial court in terms of temporary layoff without pay is that it really ought not to go beyond 3 months. In a case where an organization is contemplating having to shut down for as long as a year, I think you're going to have to consider whether or not retrenchment is required in the circumstance. But again, it's really trying to avoid short-term decisions that could have long-term impact.
To answer Pamela Jurai's question, where she asked whereby a company is putting persons on leave using accrued vacation, but employees are not working yet continuing to pay persons who do not have any accrued leave, would that lead to an IR issue? And the answer, Pamela, is yes, it can lead to an IR issue. Vacation is considered to be an earned entitlement, which means that an employer cannot generally impose the use of vacation leave on an employee. What we advise, to be totally correct from an industrial relations perspective, is we provide the opportunity for employees to utilize their outstanding vacation leave in an attempt to continue to receive pay in instances where a decision has made that these jobs will not continue to operate and therefore they will be treated as no pay leave for the time. So that yes, it can create an IR issue. Additionally, and there can be another IR issue of inequitable treatment of employees, where we send some persons on vacation leave and pay them, and then we force other persons, and I would like use the word force in inverted commas, but we ask other persons to comply with not continuing to receive pay. So we have to be careful about how we operate in the environment to make sure that we don't trod on any employee rights or breach any IR principle or practice. Charlotte, to answer your question about an employee's refusal to work, we do have a piece of legislation in Trinidad that addresses refusal to work on the part of employees. And in the first instance, an employee is required to inform his employer of a potential breach or a potential concern and allow the employer a reasonable period of time to address that breach before refusing to work. So that protocols are designed through the law, and most organizations have a health and safety protocol that is designed to address that particular issue.
Yeah, sorry, and it does indicate that there ought to be a serious and immediate or threat to life and safety. So correct. The Occupational Safety and Health Act does make those provisions. But the bottom line is that I expect that there are probably going to be challenges by workers, because people are going to claim that in the current circumstance, there is an immediate threat to their life or their safety. And there are going to be a lot of challenges. And I think, as Dan said, organizations have to make sure that they do everything within their power to make the place safe, because of course employers also have a legal responsibility to provide a safe place of work for their employees. So there's no question that there are going to be lots of challenges, and I see we have
the esteemed Sati Gajada Ines.
Comrade Sati online, so I'm being very careful now.
So Ms. Gajada Ines, would you like to ask your question? And
yes, good night.
Hi,
good night. I just want, you mentioned the testing, temperature testing.
Yes.
In most cases where there are temperature testing recommendations, there's recommendation for some sort of policy. I didn't hear you mention that.
Yes.
And also because medical is considered, temperature testing is considered to be a medical, should I say a medical, part of a medical procedure. There's also some level of responsibility as who takes the test, you know, that kind of thing. And I think that is very important, because a lot of people is moving to temperature testing. Yeah. So I think, you know, some level of protocol, you know, that should be a discussion, you know, that people need to consider.
Yeah, and in fact, I think, in general, as Jen mentioned, in general, all these new protocols, and we're really making it up as we go along, because we've never faced something like this, certainly in our lifetime. But all these protocols that need to be implemented, there's no question that there needs to be prior consultation with the workers themselves, and in the event that there's a recognized majority union, obviously to engage the union in implementing these new procedures and protocols.
And Sati, to answer that question, you are very correct that an organization does need to develop at least some temporary protocol and procedure. Particularly in respect of the temperature testing, the ILO recommendation is that temperature testing is specifically for entry into the environment, so that it is not necessarily to determine any sort of medical issue at all, but to say that the natural temperature of a person is 37.5 degrees Celsius. And if we are to record a temperature 1 degree above that, we will not allow you entry, on the condition that you may have an issue that is taking place. So,
sorry, go ahead.
That point is very well taken, and I know that like the OWTU that you represent, you are very strong on health and safety, particularly in terms of respecting individual rights in the process of employment, so that in the creation of these protocols, policies, and procedures, we need to be careful that we do not trample on any individual rights in pursuit of protecting the whole.
And I just want to touch on one more thing, if I might. I think health and safety, as it pertains to, not because the requirement is 50% of your workforce, that you will just send home 50% of your workforce. It must be determined by the plant and machinery or the environment and the work to be done. Because it doesn't make sense we're saving people from COVID and killing them because of the mismanagement of manpower.
That's right, lives versus livelihood.
Yeah, and coming back to the temperature issue just for a second, I think the ideal situation is to look for non-intrusive means of checking temperature as well. So making sure that we invest in the temperature guns and those sort of things is not that you're being it's not an intrusive exercise.
I agree with that, thanks.
Yeah. Risha Ferdinand, you have your hand up for quite a while.
Hi, good night. Good night, everyone. I have a question with regards to employees' rights. From all of the analyses that were conducted, have you seen where employees' rights were infringed upon? And if yes, how was that infringed upon, and what can the employer do to prevent such from reoccurring, to protect themselves in the future post-COVID?
Well, let
Thank
me
you.
try to answer that. We haven't done any research into whether employees' rights were infringed upon, but I will hazard a guess to say that I have no doubt that somewhere along the way, somebody's rights would have been infringed upon, or certainly they would deem that they have been infringed upon. And that is not going to be escapable, quite frankly, 100%. And I think, as Jen said, the main thing is to have consultation, have discussion. At the end of the day, managers or organizations are going to have to take decisions that are in the best interest of the whole of the organization. Sometimes it is not possible, well, not sometimes, I suppose it's never possible to please everybody. And the good of the whole is going to outweigh the good of the individual sometimes, and some hard decisions are going to have to be taken. I think what is important is that any decision that is taken is equitable, it's just, it's subject to good industrial relations practice, and it's done after prior consultation and, where possible, agreement with all the people who are to be impacted.
Or their representatives.
Yeah, or their representatives. If they do
to answer the question from Roger B. Sessa in respect of risk assessments and HSSE guidelines for employers to restart work, the ILO is actually a fantastic resource with a lot of free information that assists us. The ILO actually has something called a 6-step COVID-19 business continuity plan for small and medium enterprises, which we would be happy to share the link to, that gives us a very detailed questionnaire and an assessment to let us know whether we are prepared as an organization to restart. I know that World Health Organization also has a free risk assessment on their webpage. So that's a very good resource. As Gerard said, we really are dealing with this, a lot of us, for the very first time. And therefore, we are relying on the experts in the area to guide us. The major aspect of dealing with COVID is that we do not trample on rights. And as Sati said, we can't risk livelihoods for lives and vice versa. So we have to have a balance of probabilities, and we have to serve the whole rather than individual requirements throughout this process. Megan,
go ahead, Jeff.
Megan, you have asked, can companies temporarily lay off workers if there is no provision in a collective agreement or the employee's contract of employment? The short answer to that, Megan, is yes. An organization can make that decision, but it is within certain parameters and based on certain IR principles and practices that have to be abided by. The suspension of any terms and conditions, the stoppage of any salaries and benefits is something that we have to carefully maneuver around. And our advice would always be, when considering temporary layoffs, that you get expert advice before making a decision, because as anybody in industrial relations would tell you, our principles and practices do not change. However, the application of them may vary based on the circumstances of each situation. But the short answer to your question is that yes, once the proper process is carried out.
And of course, it does not indemnify you from the possibility that a claim for constructive dismissal or repudiation of the contract of employment may arise.
Correct.
But the court has really said that what you need to do in cases like that is to make sure that you're not using that, or you're not using the COVID-19 situation as an excuse to do things that really are not warranted by the situation. So there really should be things that are warranted by the COVID-19 situation, as well as the financial circumstances of the company, and that you should have proper consultation, and that all the decisions be, as I say, fair, equitable, and just in the circumstances, and that they apply across the board. But bottom line, as I say, temporary layoff is an acceptable decision in industrial relations in circumstances like this, which are really force majeure circumstances, where the employer or the business is, the changes are totally out of the control of the business.
Michelle MC, you asked a question: how do you deal with persons who are returning to work after maternity leave, or a person who is presenting pregnancy? The Maternity Protection Act, which exists as a piece of legislation, actually already articulates that. not specifically in terms of a disease or a virus or a pandemic, but it does ascertain what are the rights and responsibilities of both the employee and the employer in dealing with a pregnant individual or somebody who has to return to work after maternity leave.
Yeah, to address Clarice Ruplal's question as well, can you reduce or remove allowances unilaterally, example, travel or sell in an attempt to reduce expenses? And I think, as we mentioned before, that the operative word there is unilaterally. No, you ought not to do any such things unilaterally. As we say, that could lead to issues of repudiation of contract and constructive dismissal. It can be done, but it should only be done if absolutely necessary and after proper consultation with the people to be affected.
Aaliyah Hamel-Smith, you've asked a question in respect of a company that has paid its employees for 2 months with full salaries, but has the option now of reducing salaries, and whether a company can legitimately exit an employee for refusing to accept these modified terms of employment. Without knowing the actual details of the case, we would always guide against a decision to exit an employee before getting advice on the circumstances. Based on what you have stated there, you cannot just simply exit an employee for refusing to accept a reduced salary. The fact is that an employee has a right to the terms and conditions to which they've grown accustomed, and they have a right to the terms within their contracts of employment. Employers have a right and a responsibility to properly consult with employees in instances where there is a considered change to those terms and conditions. But to say that we will exit or terminate or separate with an employee simply because of a refusal to accept a reduced salary, on the surface of it, we will advise against doing that. S. Pabaru, you've been waiting for a bit.
I think you meant a work from home policy. Yeah.
S. Pabaru, we're waiting for a question.
I think the person lowered their hand eventually.
Okay.
So,
all right. Sorry about that. If you want to come back in, we'll give you priority.
We have Alicia Ali with a raised hand.
Alicia?
Yes. Hi. Good night. My
Hi.
name is Alicia Ali. My question is, right, as right now, how all these supermarkets have the washing facilities outside, right? Is it possible that all businesses should have that right now before they open up? Because I honestly believe that they should have, all businesses, malls, all establishments should continue the same procedure with a sink with running water and hand sanitizer and the same face mask. Like, for example, if it's a jewelry store, right, 6 feet away, you know, certain amount of people in the jewelry store, you know, basic questions like this, right? Because it is a pandemic and we have to take it seriously, because when the country opened back, we don't know what is coming back here. And we don't want the same procedure to come back again. We are trying to prevent it. So my suggestion is, I will kindly ask the relevant authority for businesses to put a sink facility outside their business before reopening all business, that including malls, even a small shop, a roti shop, it doesn't matter.
And that, Alicia, is very much in keeping with the guidelines that are set out in terms of prevention of the disease, that these safe to work protocols ought to include, and when we started the presentation, we referred to the simple thing like hand washing, so that in an environment where you have a bunch of stakeholders, employees, clients, suppliers, distributors, but a number of people coming to your establishment, you have an overarching responsibility to safety first. And that includes, in relation to this particular pandemic, washing of hands, wearing of face masks, so that it is in the best interest of all to continue those until such time that we have even when we have a vaccine, we still have to prevent.
And I think to be fair, that I would expect that as part of the return to work procedures, there are going to be regulations that businesses are going to have to follow along those lines. I think they're going to have to be, if legislation is required, I suspect that it will be, because there's going to have to be a number of controls put in place that have to be enforceable to make sure that we don't allow the continued spread of the virus. So I suspect that you're going to see, if not legislation, but guidelines on procedures that have to be followed by all businesses. And a number of them, I understand, are already implementing measures to take care of things like washing of hands, placement of hand sanitizers, cleaning of workstations, and gathering areas, and all of that.
To answer S. Pavaru, because I see you wrote your question, and to answer your question as a priority, what are the guidelines on a work from home policy? And a lot of organizations in Trinidad and Tobago have not in the past used telecommuting, or they have not considered the use of technology in not just work from home, but other locations for work. And therefore, any recommendation to work from home policy should be based on the requirements of your business. There is no silver bullet in dealing with a policy like that, but you do have to consider primarily the requirements of your business, how you service your end users or your customers, your clients, and how best can we facilitate that. We have some back office jobs that can be facilitated from home. And I think that a lot of companies have realized that we don't necessarily need warm bodies in seats to have productivity in the organization. But this has to be on an organization by organization basis. There has to be a proper analysis before a clear work from home policy can be created. But the fact is that we need to create it.
And I think the fact that we have distinguished attendees like Comrade Sati here tonight, I just want to make a call for the trade union movement as well to seek to get the tripartite dialogue going, because there are lots and lots of discussions that are going to have to take place among the social partners of government, business, and trade unions in terms of the way forward. And there's going to be I expect that there's going to be a huge demand for increased levels of sick leave with pay, for instance. Perhaps a demand for other things like the ill-fated pandemic leave idea that was floated by the Minister of Labor and which disappeared. I expect that there's going to be demand for things like that because there's going to be a need. We're going to have to engage in discussions and decide, well, how can we trade off some of these things? Do we look at, because we have to maintain the success of the organizations and the profitability and survival of many organizations. So they're going to have to be trade-offs made. So I think the sooner we can get into consultations like that, I mean, just thinking outside the box, for instance, we have 14 public holidays in this country. Yeah. Maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea for someone to consider, if nothing else, a temporary reduction of the number of public holidays and add it on to sick leave with pay instead, just to deal with this situation until it's over. Things like that. I think we're going to have to start discussion.
Ms. Beckles?
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Pinard. Nice seeing you. Thanks to all the associations for this really rich and comprehensive discussion. I want to talk some comment a bit on the issue of working from home. Mm-hmm. You know, I am here at the UN and I can tell you I'm working 3 times harder than if I was in my office. Yeah. And you know, I know it's not something that we have been too accustomed in Trinidad, because I mean, there are ways and means that you can monitor it. So I just wanted to some comments a little more on that, because it's really actually a very good way. I mean, depending on, of course, the kind of organization that you have, it's not very easy, but there are some organizations that should think about it seriously, because I mean, I'm telling you, in working from home, there really is no time. I mean, people send you emails all night, all day. They expect you to be up all around. So I just wanted to get a comment on that. And the other one is the issue of the digital platform, you know, and the extent to which recommendations should be made for organizations to train their staff a lot more. One of the biggest challenges I have found now is that I've had to learn very fast, because every meeting is on all these multiplicity of platforms, and the extent to which, as business owners, that they can easily access their staff, and the extent to which they are technology savvy would really help a lot of the businesses to do a lot better. So just if you can comment on that. Thank you very much.
And in respect, in fact, Gerard and I were having a discussion in preparation for this session about the fact that the research is showing that the workday has on average increased by 3 hours. And while employers generally rely on time to determine productivity, what COVID-19 has shown is that people actually are working longer. They are more accessible because they are supposed to be at home, because we have stay-at-home procedures in place, and that there is almost an unrealistic expectation for people to continue to work into all hours of the days and nights. As employers, we need to be very, very aware of the concept of work-life balance, and that even though we are now more readily available through the use of technology to actually work, we have to consider a balance between output and time away from work. So it's very, very critical that employers look from a philosophical perspective as to how they feel about the work-life balance. In Trinidad, and I'm very proud to say that a lot of our clients, that is Zatopek's clients, have actually introduced policies regarding work-life balance to address particularly that, and created protocols for the use of technology and responding to work-related issues during this time. In respect of the use of technology and the training, there is actually a McKinsey report, and Gerard, I think you would have seen it as well, that is addressing that requirement for multi-skilling of employees. And that in Trinidad, because we have not generally applied technology, we have had lofty plans too, but we've kind of been thrust into the future in the present. We have to ensure that we properly train and skill our staff before we call on them to perform at a certain level. That is an industrial relations concept that we cannot at all not follow. Proper training, adequate exposure, adequate retraining, and opportunity to correct any shortcomings is critical during this time, even from a work from home perspective. And Gerard, you could add.
And there also, to address your point, Ms. Beckles, there is also a mindset challenge that we have, that we will have to address, especially with the managers and the senior people in organizations, because some people still have the feeling that they have to see you, and they have to be able to see you in your office and over your shoulders, making sure that you're working on, and less focus, if you want, on outcomes and deliverables. And I think this is perhaps one of the silver linings that we have arising out of this experience is that people have been forced to find more, if you want, more forward-thinking ways of addressing performance in the absence of being able to see people and know that they're there. Because, we have a kind of mindset that you clock in at 8 o'clock and you clock out at 4 o'clock, and once you're there, that you're putting out a good day's work, where nothing may be further from the truth. And it's also an opportunity, I think, a great opportunity for us, as Jen says, to improve the work-life balance issues as well, because it's also giving workers more opportunity to spend time, especially with their families and with their children especially. And as I say, there are going to be some trade-offs, and we need to have some flexible arrangements and some rigidity as well about reporting requirements. That has been one of the concerns expressed by some of the employers, for instance, that, well, I can't keep tabs of people. Well, you have to get more creative, and you have to get more innovative in terms of how do you report? How do you ensure that what is supposed to be done is being done? And it is a challenge, as I say. I think it's mostly a mindset challenge, quite frankly, but perhaps it's a good challenge that we have to face.
To answer Shelley-Ann Emmert's question regarding vacation and can an employer cancel vacation and how can HR treat with this, there is always a proviso on the approval of vacation leave, and that it always is sometimes unwritten, subject to the operational exigencies of the organization. So there may be circumstances where an organization can cancel an approval on a vacation, in exceptional circumstances call you out to work when you already have pre-approved vacation. But again, in dealing with this, we need to make sure that we comply with good HR and IR principle and practice. It's not a one answer fits all situation. It's strictly based on the circumstances surrounding it. And Vishnu Balrup, you've made a comment there that the employee manual has to be rewritten to address the new norm. And that is in fact exactly what has come out of the ILO and the International Trade Union Confederation when they put out their joint statement that basically we need to rethink what normal is, so that we cannot expect that the policies and procedures that we have had in place from time immemorial will be applicable in these circumstances. We have to become creative, we have to become innovative, but we have to be guided by good industrial relations principle and practice.
I see Eric Bernard make a very good point there as well, which I think is another part of the silver lining. Piggybacking on Ms. Beckles' point, that it would also help reduce traffic, which is a good thing. Yes, and the fact that we are going to need to stagger working arrangements in order to maintain the social distancing issues at the workplace means that, you know, we've been talking for decades about the need to stagger working hours and stagger working arrangements so that we reduce the peak time traffics in the island. Again, another silver lining that we're going to have to find creative ways. It's going to have to be a subject of discussion with the workers and with the workers, their trade union representatives. But there are lots of opportunities here. And just to elaborate on Jen's point there as well, in terms of the return to normal, I think the sooner we can disabuse our minds of any notion that there's going to be a return to normal, the better for us. There is going to be no return to what was the normal. What we are doing now is we are creating a new normal for the future, and that is what we have to focus on. And every organization is going to have to take some real hard looks at their business and how they run their business, how they manage their work. As Ms. Beckles says, I think there's no question that there's going to be a lot more focus on work from home and remote work procedures and the needs for technology training that is going to come along with that. And not only technology training, but infrastructural development, because there are many people who live in areas that do not have effective, if you want, or reliable telecommunications services. And that is an issue that's going to have to be addressed as well. But there are lots of opportunities. But as I say, forget the past, because the past is not coming back. We are talking about creating a new normal now, and each organization has to take a real hard look at its work arrangements, its processes, how it gets its job done, and decide how it's going to happen in the future. I think if we think that way, rather than riding out a situation so that we could go back to what it was, I think we'll be better off to face the challenges of the future.
And Nakli Chuchu, you asked the question about can an organization continue a salary reduction beyond 3 months? The answer, the short answer to that is yes. If an organization cannot afford to pay its employees, and it cannot simply be based on a single faceted issue, it must be that an organization has to do some serious analysis to determine what is going to be its affordability and for how long. And how do we mitigate against a continuous reduction in salary? So again, we would have to look at the individual circumstances of the case, but the plaster on it that I can tell you is that an organization has to engage in proper consultation with its employees or their employee representatives before institution any change to customary terms and conditions or contractual terms and conditions. Denise Kamal, you have asked what are the options available to an employer in the case of an employee that is deemed vulnerable. Very simply, we can utilize our work from home procedures if they exist. If not, it is up to an organization to look at how it intends to deal with that situation. There is no cut and paste answer that can be given because vulnerabilities are based on different things. It may be as a result of not having proper transportation to come to work, or it may be an underlying condition, or it may mean that I have a relative who I have to take care of. And because of the suspension of all of these non-essential services, there is nobody that can take care of the person, a normal caretaker. Those are all circumstances that would be considered vulnerable, because remember, it's not just about the individual employee, but also the extended family that is related to that employee that we have to consider. So that it's not, as I said, a cut and paste answer, but an employer, can make a determination that they will deal with things in terms of level of seriousness.
Yeah, I think we also need to be guided a lot by the conventions and recommendations of the ILO in a lot of these matters. Now, we may not be signatories to many of the conventions, and the conventions may be far advanced in terms of their applicability than we are currently capable of dealing with in Trinidad and Tobago. But I think the guidance that is provided by some of these ILO recommendations and conventions is useful as a way forward in terms of what our aspirations should be as employers moving forward. And they have recommendations in respect of all these things that we're discussing, including the desirability of making sure that people do not lose pay because they are unable to work, or because they, for instance, the whole question of pandemic leave, as I say, or the need for self-quarantine. That is not something that is currently addressed in most collective agreements or in legislation here. So the very fact is that if someone has to be self-quarantined, when they exhaust their paid sick leave eligibility under their contracts of employment, currently that's a challenge. That's an open area, because in the absence of anything else, people are going to end up being on extended sick leave without pay. And there's need to address things like that. As I say, and the tripartite dialogue is going to be very useful in addressing some of those things.
Adele Pereira, you have a question?
Yes, hi, good evening to everyone. And let me first thank you for a great presentation. I know everyone is sitting around just waiting to see what the government is, ready to present in terms of reopening, etc. But under these circumstances, can an employer reasonably expect, should, companies be able to reopen, can an employer reasonably expect that employees would have had sufficient time to put measures in place for babysitting so that they don't have to, come back and ask for additional measures or ask for additional time to be able to take care of, their children? Because if, schools are still closed and parents have to go back to work,
yes,
what are they going to really do with children at home?
Yeah, and to give you what is likely to be an unpopular answer, the fact is that arrangements are going to have to be made, because the organizations are going to have to continue their business and to be able to have their businesses running. And that means that they're going to have employees available to return to work. What we need perhaps is more institutional support. A lot of organizations, again, are going to have to start looking into things, organizations that haven't done it in the past, looking into things, for instance, like daycare arrangements. That if you have a number of employees, especially in lots of cases where you have female employees who may have young children at home, and so the forward-looking organizations are going to have to start thinking about, well, how do I make sure that it is possible for my workers to be able to come to work and to be productive and not have to worry about the fact that they have children at home unsupervised also. There's no easy solution to it, and as I say, there's a balance to be reached, but because the organizations have to run, the organizations have to be able to return to earning income so that they could continue to survive, so that they could continue to provide jobs for people, for instance. And there's going to have to be trade-offs. There's no question about it. But there's
Shamla Mohammed, you asked a question about office buildings that don't allow for natural ventilation. There are actually mechanical ventilation units that can be used in circumstances where you don't have windows, doors, or proper ventilation allowed. That's a very technical question, and our expertise is IR, so that is unfortunately the extent of the answer I could give you to your question in terms of how do you deal with fresh air being circulated. All the research I've done shows is that there are mechanical options that are available. Somebody else, Mr. Dexter Emmerich, you made a comment there about for too long many organizations have failed at effective leadership on COVID. And actually what we've seen is that there has been an even bigger call for leadership in this time. And not just leadership from the perspective of disaster management or making sure that businesses remain viable, but leadership from the perspective of rallying the troops. We are all in this together, every single one of us, and we are all figuring it out. But the best way to do it is for us to do it together. And sometimes I think as a country, as a mentality, sometimes we look to an individual for leadership. Gerard is a huge advocate for tripartite consultation and discussion. And I think that now is an absolutely fantastic time for government, labor, and business, and special interest groups as well, to come together and let's figure this thing out together for the betterment of Trinidad and Tobago. We all not going to get it correct. And we all are not going to be able to say at the end of this whether we actually did as best a job as we could have. But what we can say is that we all worked our hardest and we put the good of the whole before the good of any individual. It's a great opportunity for us to have leaders who we did not think were leaders within the employment arrangement, in the public sphere, and even in our own private lives, to show that we are prepared to take on the mantle of steering the ship when it's our turn, because at some point we each are going to be called upon to lead. So as I see it, we are eternal optimists at Zatopek Solutions. We are going to see a brighter day. But in the interim, let's all work together and let's work real hard together so that we could all get through this. It's not lives over livelihood, nor is it livelihood over lives. It's a very precarious balance.
I think something that is needed as well, and as much as we have so many members of the business community here as well, is some more, I don't want to say pressure, but some more encouragement to the government to provide more direct support to business to keep employment generated and to keep employment going. Unfortunately, in my view, there has not been enough attention to that. The focus has been placed in the wrong place, in my view, in that we've instituted these salary relief grants for those who lose their jobs or who get their income reduced. I think the focus really ought to be more on direct support to businesses to make sure that people don't lose their jobs. I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel neither. The UK, the US, Canada have all instituted programs of soft loans that are even convertible to grants that are used specifically for the purpose of retaining workers during this unfortunate situation. I know the financial circumstances are dire, but I think sometimes we tend to cost the cost of doing something, and we don't assess the cost of not doing it. And I think if we really run a proper cost on, if we don't do things to keep people employed, I think we will find that that cost outweighs the cost of doing something to keep people employed. So I think to some extent there needs to be some more lobbying, in my view, on the part of business to get more direct support to businesses for the main purpose of keeping them stable and keeping people employed, because the consequences are going to be very, very dire if we don't do that, and if many businesses go out of business or they're forced to reduce the numbers of staff that they have, and so to deal with what we hope is going to be a short-term cash flow issue and economic challenge issue.
Gillian Simon asked a lovely question. What is the impact of COVID-19 on the industrial relations landscape in Trinidad and Tobago? And Gillian, as the president of the Industrial Court, said, it's a brand new time for us in industrial relations. We have had so many opportunities to reinvent ourselves in industrial relations. And I think that with every passing day, we are seeing that industrial relations at its heart, principles and practices are not necessarily changing. What is changing then is that we now have to become more innovative and we have to become creative in our solutions, because the contract between an employee and employer, it continues to remain a sacred thing. But it does not mean that we cannot change the process that we use to get a better result. The landscape is going to change very much because we're going to see a bunch of new trade disputes that are coming before the Ministry of Labor and the Industrial Court. And we are going to have to consider, from the perspective of both the employer and employee, are those disputes so serious or so heinous that they would have been considered to be a breach of our basic terms and conditions, our basic contract, that we need to pursue them. So there's going to be, I think, an exercise of restraint from all parties in terms of the industrial relations landscape. But what I can tell you, Jill, is that it's going to be a very exciting time when we get into the new normal.
I see Alison raising her questions about how do we deal with situations where persons with a known history of allergies presents in the workplace with a flare-up is not discriminated against. And how would the employer and employees who may be in direct contact with such persons know the difference in order to be fair to the individual and preserve their own health? And that is going to be one of the major challenges, because nowadays, and especially with the Sahara dust situation that we have, I'm afraid to sneeze or to cough because people start disappearing from around me as soon as I do. It's going to be a challenge, and that's why we have to rely really on the advice of the medical health professionals to implement the kind of arrangements to make sure that we properly test who is susceptible or who genuinely is showing symptoms that may be related to COVID-19. We're going to have to rely on the protocols that have been developed and that are being developed for us. And of course, in all cases, I think you're going to have to err on the side of caution. So even if it is that you're not sure but a person is symptomatic and crosses all the hurdles that are required to be considered to be at risk, I think you're going to have to take the steps to protect the safety and health of all your staff from the person while making reasonable arrangements to isolate the person or to separate the person from being able to infect other people.
Somebody asked a question on job sharing and asked that we elaborate a bit on it. Job sharing is not something that's new in HR. It's actually, the concept of job sharing is actually where we take one job, but we have more than one person perform the job on a let's say sometimes a part-time basis to ensure that we have employment for all. With the development of COVID and the impact on organizations, some jobs, like let's say jobs that are customer facing, may not be able to continue for a while. And there are some jobs that would continue, like some back office job. Let's look at things like finance department that continues. Some of those jobs, you can actually take some of the duties and we can take a job and we can change it from just technical and administrative functions together, break those into two, and use somebody who may be in a customer service type environment and have them do the administrative type duties. So that instead of one person being at home with reduced pay or no pay at all, we now have two persons working on a schedule. So it will facilitate our physical distancing protocols, and it will ensure that we do not have extra congregation in the office. And it would also allow us to keep two persons employed, even if it's on a partial basis. So job sharing, and there are different forms and fashions of it, but that's generally how it applies.
And as we said, it's going to call for a lot of dialogue and flexibility on the part of trade unions and the employers to manage some of these these minefields, but hard decisions are going to have to be taken, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences sometimes. But I think the main thing we keep saying is that the decisions must be really honest, equitable, fair, and just in the circumstances, and as much as we can, spread the burden equitably across the board so that individuals do not end up suffering more than others. So if it is possible, if it is necessary sometimes to reduce even the requirements for individuals, certain individuals, and to spread it along. If there's a reduced need for work, for instance, and you no longer need 10 people doing something, but you could do it with 7 people, maybe there's an option to spread the work across the 10 people and consider a reduction in the compensation accordingly, rather than have to let go 3 people. As I said, hard decisions, but I think they have to be made.
Job preservation at the end of the day, as far as it's reasonable and practicable. Crystal Palarat, you made a comment there about ensuring proper job descriptions and performance management tools are used. And I think that in going forward, we are, as employers particularly, we are going to have to be driven more by productivity measures more than time. And more than looking at a person's work. So we're gonna have to be able to set targets, and it's not a new thing. Lots of people who have done strategic HR would know that we basically could bring any job, any task down to a numerical figure. And when we create those realistic targets, because they also have to be realistic, we can hold people accountable to them. Once we provide them with the proper resources, tools, and training, then performance management is actually not going to be that difficult. But it's the responsibility of the employers and those of us who are in charge and those of us who give advice to make sure that we create the tools that are going to allow us to move into the new normal. The world of work has been changing for a very long time. A lot of the literature over the last couple of years has been about the fact that jobs like HR jobs, the jobs that we call the softer jobs, are going to be the jobs that are going to be more important, because we can mechanize so many other functions. And perhaps, as I said earlier, we are being thrust into the future in the present. We have to move much quicker than we thought we could, and some of our strategic plans are going to have to take a hit, because we're going to have to quickly adjust to the new normal and get our organizations operating for the benefit of all, and primarily the maximization of profit. Those are sometimes curse words, but that's the point of business, to maximize profitability. But there's a way that we do it. And all we are saying from our perspective as Zatopek is, let's figure out together the right way and the best way to do it for all of us.
Yeah, Gillian is making a point, Gillian Simon making a point that the company doctor will have a greater role in assisting management in the organization. Right. And that is unquestionably so. We are really relying very heavily on the medical professionals in terms of how we address this issue until we can consider it in the past. And there's no question that we have to be guided by the medical professionals as we go along. I see Denzi Rambasad asking, can retirement age be reduced as we go forward in this new normal? That is a very complicated issue, because retirement age is often linked to things like pension plans and pension arrangements. And there are huge cost implications to any consideration for reducing retirement age, not only internally if there are pension plans, but on the national insurance scheme as well, yes. Which already is in serious has serious challenges going forward. And in fact, the tendency or the trends internationally have been not to reduce retirement age, but to increase retirement age, to make sure that you have people contributing to these national insurance systems for a longer period of time. And because people are living longer with medical advances and so I can't see retirement age being reduced as something that is likely to happen.
Mm-hmm. Somebody asked earlier a question about how NIB could assist us through this process. And the reality is that NIB provides a suite of benefits that I don't think is going to change anytime soon. I know it's going to have to be government intervention and government decisions and new protocols from that perspective that's going to address those issues. So we have the customary sick leave benefits that and injury leave benefits, those sorts of benefits that we can normally access from NID. But as of now, we cannot speak to how else beside the norm that it can be addressed. Sonia Kelsick asked the question about discussing the concept of measuring performance based on an assessment of best that the employee can do under the circumstances versus traditional output measures. And Sonia, you couldn't have said it better. The reality is that how we measured performance in the past was based on a certain paradigm. And that paradigm has changed. It has changed over the last 6 weeks of our existence. For example, Zatopek has continued to operate, and we have done everything via technology, via email, via telephone, without either Gerard or I having to physically leave our premises, leave our homes. And therefore, we need to look more at output and measuring value added, rather than just hours be in front of a computer or at a workstation, to determine that we are actually getting what it is that we are paying for. At the end of the day, we're in a contract. I sell you my labor services and you pay me a fee that we both consider to be reasonable or acceptable at the time that the contract is made. So that I ought to be, as the person paying for the service, I ought to get value for that service. And as the person who's providing my labor, I ought to believe that my labor is being adequately paid for. But in between that, we have a whole bunch of other things. We have employee engagement, we have motivation, we have a lot of other things. As Mr. Emrit said earlier, soft is the new hard. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that measuring performance is not going to be as it was before. However, what we do need to understand is that we first have to determine how do we measure that performance. We cannot just say it needs to be measured. We have to determine how do we measure it. And we have to engage in proper and robust discussion with all employees, in fact, with all stakeholders, before we unilaterally impose anything on the workforce. While some persons may hold the view that I'm paying you and I require that to work even though you're at home, the reality is that somebody may be at home in an environment where they don't necessarily have accommodation that they can work 8 hours as they normally do, or they may be caretaking for children or an elderly person or a sickly person. So that we do have to be measured and reasonable in addressing performance and measuring performance going forward. But it's going to also require huge amounts of trust. The trust is imperative in that regard, both on the end of the employer, that the employee is giving you his just due, and on the end of the employee, that the employer is doing the best.
And I think the one thing we can't escape the fact that there are going to be people on either side of the table who would seek to take advantage of situations like that. Unfortunately, that's just the way of life sometimes. So that there are some unscrupulous employers who are going to use this situation as an excuse to do things that they didn't think they could do before. And by the same token, there are going to be some workers who are going to use this situation to take advantage of the fact and perhaps not put in a full day's work. Those are the issues we're going to have to address. I see Mahadeo Kanhai asked a question about whether any research was conducted to determine potential reduction in demand by consumers, as this will determine the amount of employees companies will be able to retain. I'm not sure if there's been any research per se, but we know certainly that in certain organizations, it's likely to have a much bigger impact than others. I mean, for instance, you have some whole industries that have been shut down. I mean, you can think of the airline industry as a prime example. That is likely to last a little while. An organization like Caribbean Airlines, for instance, where you are no longer flying, and we don't know how long it will be before they could resume flying. Right off the bat, their demand, if you want, by consumers has gone to zero, totally zero. So their demand and their income has gone to zero. Some organizations, as Jen said, in our case, although we've been impacted, it hasn't been to the same extent in the service area because there's so much that can be done remotely and electronically. Not that they haven't been impacted, but some businesses, retail businesses, for instance, restaurants, they have been much more severely impacted than others. I don't think anybody can as yet put a handle in terms of how significant the impact is going to be on the organizations. It's really going to be determined, I think, by how quickly we can restart businesses, and even if it's on a phased basis, so that as quickly as possible we get back into a situation where businesses can once more earn income and therefore be able to afford to pay salaries and to afford to stay in business. There is absolutely no question that some businesses are not going to survive. There are already businesses which are pondering closing down already, even after just 6 weeks, is it? Not all businesses, a lot of smaller businesses in particular, their cash flow situations are such that they work on a month-to-month basis. They survive on a month-to-month basis. Some of them rely heavily on overdraft facilities and banking facilities and loans, which they haven't been able to pay. And there are going to be some businesses that are going to be lost. There's no question about it. The longer it goes, the more such businesses there are going to be. And that's just the reality.
Julia Kozia, you made a statement there about the provision of adequate PPE. And under our current good industrial relations principle and practice, we have as an employer an overarching responsibility to protect our employees, to ensure that there is a safe working environment. And as much as we would like to say that we could just provide the proper PPE and have people come back to work, we may not necessarily need people to physically come back to work. So that may not even be a consideration. With work from home, remote working policies in place, with the opportunity for the use of technology, we may not even have to cross that hurdle. So again, it comes back to us looking at our core business and our operations and determining how best do we serve our business and our clientele so we could continue to remain viable. The provision of PPE is not the solution to having persons come back out to work. But once we do, we have a requirement. And Sati will reiterate that we have a requirement to provide the proper personal protective equipment to have people adequately perform their jobs. We cannot place people in unsafe situations or unsafe circumstances.
You see, Jonathan Bihari making a point as well that despite all the benefits of work from home, there are drawbacks to consider, such as loss of camaraderie, difficulty in managing, and issues regarding security or sensitivity of work documents. And clearly, and I think that's one of the big things that not too many people are considering, and that is the whole social impact, or the impact on the social interaction between people. Because at the end of the day, organizations are about people, and they're about people interacting and people working collaboratively to achieve certain outcomes. That is taking a huge hit, because you cannot achieve through a Zoom conference or the same things that you can achieve in a face-to-face meeting or meeting of people, and the social interact that builds teamwork, for instance, and builds strength and builds interpersonal relationships. That is taking a hit. It is taking a hit. I think the other aspect, which some people have touched on, but again hasn't got, I see at least in the Ministry of Health briefings, they've started to focus on it a little bit more, is the whole mental health impact of this situation. And we're going to have to be very serious about addressing that, because that's something that very often goes unaddressed. These situations are going to have a mental health impact on people as well. And we have to be aware of that, and we have to put measures in place to deal with that.
Tati?
And good night, everybody, again. I just want to touch on a few quick points. One, while we speaking about the work from home, my thing is that I agree with Penelope, Miss Penelope, that the thing about it is that the work is extended. So the expectation in the beginning, you work 8 hours. And I was telling my comrades, who is mostly male, that we need to, my thing is that women need to consider, right now they will be enjoying it. Working at home in the PJs, being able to see about the children. But when the boss start calling you on a Sunday to do a letter, and you were right about the environment. So things, you know, working at home is one thing, but how we do it. And again, the kind of moral you will get of dressing and going outside there for somebody who is accustomed doing that, having to stay at home, after a while, people done getting at each other already, far more if they have to do it on a professional level. So the whole culture change. And also I would like to ask about, have people really considered what it is like to wear a mask, a face mask for 8 hours? We're talking about returning to work and wearing these things. But in a real environment, could an employee wear a mask? And those things have to be considered when we look at the environment that people work in, and even social distancing. As employers plan their work, they will also need to determine because especially maintenance worker, how could you really social distance when people have to work very close to each other? So even when you do it, how long you do it for, and those things, protocols will have to be discussed. And last but not least, I just want to say that while I hear you, that HR, you know, that HR, that whole profession was really needed in this time. My heart goes out, because I am an essential worker, and first and foremost, my heart goes out to all the essential workers that have worked while all the professionals was, even their